Alright, hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to talk about functions in Python. It's going to talk about the basic things that have to do with functions in Python, what kinds of functions we have, particular functions that can be used. These are inbuilt functions with Python here. We will talk about the features of functions using the def keyword to define your function, and then the function name, parentheses, parameters, the colon, indentation, the code and instructions that will be housed inside of the function and then return values. And invocation, how do we get to use functions that we have defined using the function name, adding parentheses, and then adding arguments if there are. Then we are going to look at sample functions. We'll look at a function that helps us calculate profit. We'll also look at a function that helps us find the perimeter of a rectangle or any other kind of shape. So functions are a very important tool in programming. They can make executing code easy and selective. You can bunch a group of instructions together and then use them at once when you want. So we are going to be working with Visual Studio Code and command prompts. Yes, we will be working with these two. So let's see. I'd like us to navigate into this directory. All right, so this is the directory where I'm going to create I'm going to create a folder. Okay, wrong command. All right, so the file we're going to use for this class of this lesson is going to be created inside of my cohort 2 directory, and I'll be using this command to do that. Type null greater than sign is going to be called test.py. Okay, let's do this. Let's say functions.py. All right. Yeah, now we have the file functions.py. I'm going to open this file in Visual Studio Code. That's the text editor we will use as well. All right, now while it opens, well, we can return here. So the first thing we're going to look at about functions is types of functions. What kinds of functions do we have? What types of functions do we have in Python? Inbuilt functions and then user-defined or customized functions. So basically, these are the two kinds of functions that we can talk about in Python. User-defined functions, then inbuilt functions. Okay, so functions.py. We start with inbuilt functions. Inbuilt functions are functions that come with the Python installation. They come along with the Python installation. Just like when a person is born, what are the things that come with a person? The person has a head, has hands, has legs, has several other parts of the body. These are things that are inbuilt. Then other things can be done much later. You could decide to braid your hair. You could decide to do other things that are not naturally part of you. So inbuilt functions are functions that come with a Python installation. They are used to interact with the data and do lots of things. And then user-defined functions or customized functions are functions that users create. People like you and I would create as we decide to write our Python program. So if I decide to write a program here now, I could just create my own function and call it whatever name I like, my function. And I have a function. I have a function that I have defined. So basically, we have two kinds of functions: inbuilt functions, user-defined or customized functions. All right. So we've learned that there are basically two kinds of functions in Python: inbuilt functions and user-defined or customized functions. Of course, this also holds in many of the other programming languages that we have in Java, in C, C++, JavaScript, and all the others. You would definitely have inbuilt functions. And then functions that you create by yourself, which would be user-defined functions and customized functions. So let's very quickly look at four functions that are inbuilt. One, we have the print function. Another, we have an ends with function. We have a capitalized function, and then we have an upper function. We just look at how these functions work, and after that, we'll go ahead to look at the features of functions, how to define functions, and all the different parts that have to do with the function. So first, we're going to look at the print function. How does the print function work? What does it do? The print function basically, I think, is much more important when the program that you have written will work in the terminal. So the print function is used to send messages to the terminal, send messages to the console, so that the users of that application can, get information about the application. It's very simple to use. You just type print parentheses, and then the message you want to send. I could send a numerical value. I could place a numerical value between these parentheses, which we would call the argument. For example, 100. This is numerical value. And then to run the script, pi test pi, I hit enter, and the value I get is, wow, error, no such file in directory. I take it at my, oh my goodness. Yes, the name of our file is functions.py. Okay, so it should be not test.py, functions.py, enter, and then it prints 100. So one of the functions we have in Python, which is a very popular function, very easy to use, is the print function. It takes an argument or takes several arguments. And what does it do to these arguments? It prints them in the console, as we have seen here. I'll just quickly run that again, and then we can see it prints what we ask it to print in the console. That was an integer. You could also ask it to print a string. For example, this is a Python program. Save the file, returns command prompt, run the script, execute the script, and it says this is a Python program. So this is an example of a function that is very popular in Python, and that is used by programmers when they write a program that has to do. All right, back to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to print the result. This is going to give us a result string that ends with T is going to give us a result, but we won't be able to access this result except we print it. So I'm going to wrap this in parentheses for the print function. You can see we're using the print function again, and this is how the print function works. It has parentheses, and anything you want to print has to be inside of the parentheses. So that means we are printing the result of this. You can see the parentheses for the print statement begins from here and ends here. And string that ends with is a piece of code that is going to return a result. Ends with is a function that helps us interact with a string. And what it does is it's going to check if its argument here is what ends this string. And we know that this string is what we have here, times never last. So it's going to print true if we run the script. Let's run the script. When we run the script, good. Now this is a Python program, then true. So this script is actually running two programs. The first is a print statement, and the other is. So I'm just going to comment this out so that it doesn't have to be run each time. Okay, so what we have is true. It is true that string ends with a T. You need to understand the string is a variable, and What is stored inside of it is a string. Times never last is stored inside of string. So when we use this variable here, we are interacting with the value that is stored in it. So what we have is string that ends with t. Simply saying, check this variable which contains a string called times never last. Check if it ends with the value t. Now I'm going to change t to L and then save the file and return to my to command prompt to run the script. This time around, it's going to return false because the string times never last does not end with T. What if we try three letters, let's say AST? Of course, we know that this string times never last ends with AST. So this is going to return, it's going to return true. Now, one more thing I want to do is instead of print the result like this, we could store the result in a variable. For example, we could call a variable result, and then we could store the return value of this inside of result. And then we can print result instead. Print result. You're getting to learn how to use variables as well, how to define variables, and then you know how to interact with them. I am going to run this script again, and then we get true because the string times never last ends with AST. So this is another function in Python that you can use. It could also be called a string method. We don't have to talk about methods. Try to explain what methods do and why they are referred to as methods. Methods as well as are functions. So we have the ends with function, and this is how it works. Begin to observe that functions take rounded brackets, and the two functions we have used so far also take arguments in them. So let's see if there's another function we can use very quickly. There's a third function here that is called capitalize. Capitalize. What does the function capitalize do? Let's see. So let's say we want to capitalize string itself. This is how we would use the function string dot capitalize. And then you do this. So I'm going to wrap this in parentheses for print function. Then I'm going to run the script here. Let's see what the result is going to be. Pi functions.py. Okay, good. Times never last. So what's actually happening here is the first letter of the string is what gets capitalized. Here in number 2, we see the times begins with a small t, but here in the result, times now begins with a capital T. Okay, so this is how it works. String that capitalize is going to here you say, you see it says it's a method. It's a method. You can call it a method, but you don't really need to worry about why it's called a method and why I call it a function. It's still a function. So this is going to change the first letter in a string to the uppercase. It's going to capitalize the first letter in a string. That is what it does. It doesn't capitalize all of the letters in the string. It only capitalizes the first letter in the string. And you can see that in the result here. It capitalizes T times never last. Let's take a look at one more function before we go deep down to talk about how functions are defined, all of the details regarding that. Now, the fourth function we're going to look at here is upper. Upper is going to behave in a completely different way from capitalized. Before we do that, I'd like to store this in a variable called cap or caps. Good. And then I can print that variable, print caps. Sorry. Okay, now, so I'm just going to go ahead to define another variable where we're going to store the result of the next function that we want to talk about. That's upper. So I'll create a variable called upper. And then I'm going to say string, wrong spelling, string dot upper. Also, pay attention to how we always add parentheses behind the functions. We always add parentheses behind the functions. And surprisingly, in the capitalized function and in the upper function, we do not place any arguments. We don't have any value inside of this because these functions themselves do not require that kind of value. Different from the ends with function, which takes a value. So this is going to convert the whole string to the uppercase. Let's see what the result is going to be. Run the script, execute the script. All right, taking quite some time. So we have true times never last. And this is the latest code we just added to the script, times never last. So these are functions, and these functions do different things and they work in different ways. They do different things and they work in different ways. The first function we looked at was the print function. And we said the print function is used to send a message to the terminal. And ever since we've been using the print function, we used it to look at the result of the piece of code in line 3. We also use it to look at the result of the piece of code in line 5. We also use it to look at the result of the piece of code in line 8. So the print function is used to send a message to the terminal. And then we've looked at other kinds of functions. These are inbuilt functions, by the way. Again, ends with is a function. It takes an argument. What ends with does is it's going to take the argument and check for this argument in the string that is attached to it. String dot ends with. So ends with is a method that takes the string you provide here and checks for the string here to see if the string is what ends the string. I hope we're not confused with these of string, 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 string. There are two strings we have here. We have the string in times never last. We have the string here, which is times never last. And we have another string here, which is AST. So ends with is going to take AST and check if AST is what ends times never last. Then other kinds of functions and string methods. All right, we are going to go to talk about the features of functions. That's what I call them, features of functions. And then we will talk about, of course, we will talk about how to define a function, function name, parentheses, and other things. All right, so we will be talking about functions in general, what functions are, how to define your functions, and then how to invoke your functions. And this means we're talking about user-defined functions. The functions we've talked about so far are functions that come with Python, but now we want to talk about functions that we can create by ourselves and functions that we can use. So, yes, I'm going to do something that you're going to learn from. I'm going to comment out all of this code that we have written. Yes, so that this code now becomes ineffective. When I run the script now, nothing is going to be executed because I have asked Python in a way to ignore this code because I have commented the code using a group of three quotes, three double quotes, a pair of three double quotes. As you can see, I will bring this down and I will also bring this down so that you can see. So they've been wrapped in a pair of double quotes. All right, let's begin to talk about functions that we can create by ourselves in Python. And the first thing we're going to learn about creating functions in Python is that there is a rule that says you have to use a keyword called def before you create a function. So it's going to look like this when you want to create a function in Python. You type def. Now, def is a word that means definition, probably telling the Python program that you are defining a function. Defining a function. So you need to say def first before you go ahead with your function definition. After the def keyword has been typed, the next thing that follows is your function name. your function name is going to follow. And it's always advised that you define functions or you create functions, use function names that reflect the task that the function is going to carry out. So, for example, if we want to create a function that adds two numbers together, we could do something like add underscore nums, so that the name of the function actually reflects what the function does. So we can have add underscore nums and all that stuff. And you have to be very careful. Function names generally in Python, when they are defined, should not be separated if these names are going to constitute more than one word. So these names cannot be separated. It's going to cause an error. So you always need to make sure that the names are joined together, either like this, or by using an underscore, or by using what we refer to as the camel case. So it's been mentioned that the snake case, when you use an underscore like this is referred to the snake case. The snake case is recommended in Python programming. So again, in defining your own function, in creating a customized function, a user-defined function, the first thing you must do is use the def keyword. The next thing you should do is type the name of your function. And the name of your function has to reflect the task the function is going to complete. So after that, you need parentheses. And in all of the functions we've been using, we find that there are parentheses at the end of the function. So when we create our own function as well, we need to place parentheses just after the function name. And the last thing you have to do here is you need to add a colon to, yes, tell Python that yes, this is actually the function, and we are ready to write code in the function. So I think that's what the parenthesis does. If you don't add the parentheses, if you hit enter, okay, it's still indents because it's able to find that there is the def keyword here, but there is an error here as it places a sign here which says good. It says expected colon. Yes, so the correct syntax for defining a function is all of these plus a column here. When you hit enter, it comes down, and then this is how to define a function. Of course, this is not all there is to defining a function, but this is just like the beginning part of defining a function. You still need to add your pieces of code, your piece of code inside of the function. A function has to take some piece of code, and that is what we're going to work on now. We're going to add a piece of code inside of the function that the function is going to work with. All right, so this is it. The beginning of defining functions. You use the def keyword, the name of the function. There cannot be spaces. You need to link the words together, parentheses, and then a column. Now, just before we go ahead to put some code inside of the function, the brackets are meant to house parameters. There are things we call parameters. These parameters are a description of the kind of data that the function is going to work with. And they are very important for when you want to invoke the functions. So I'm just going to add something like, okay, I use first, second. This is a function that adds numbers. So we place parameters here to specify that you have to place the first number here, and then you have to place the second number here. So we get to understand this better when we invoke the function. All right, now this is inside of the function. This is the scope of the function. That's a better word to describe what it is. So this is the function scope. If you do not indent, then it's not part of the function scope. So you have to indent to show that the code you're about to enter belongs to this function. All right, so the simple thing we want to do is add numbers together. We will be adding the numbers in first and the numbers in first and second together, and we will be storing that inside of a variable. So I'm going to create the variable and call it, I'm going to call it sum. All right, now inside of sum, we're going to store the addition of first. and second. So this is what we're going to do. So this is what our function is actually doing now. We define this function here. This is the piece of code the function is going to execute, and we're going to add just one more piece of code. After the function has summed first and second together and has stored the value inside of sum, we're going to print that value and say print sum. So basically, this is how to define a function. Here we take a look at what we need. You need the def keyword, the name of the function, parentheses, a parameter or parameters, which could be optional. You could decide not to include parameters in your functions. You could decide to include parameters. Here we have included two parameters, first and second. Other two parameters we have included. And then the colon, and then the indentation, which is very, very important for a function. The indentation helps us to specify the scope of the function. The scope of the function simply means all of the code that that function is going to execute. So, for example, the code that is typed in line with this indentation forms the scope of this function. If I were to return and then delete this indentation, any code I type here would not be part of the function. It would not be part of the function add underscore nums. So the only pieces of code that are part of the function add underscore nums are the ones that are typed in line with this indentation. All right, so the indentation is very important. And then after that, code instructions. These are the code instructions we have here in line 13. We have a code instruction where we define sum. This is what we're asking the function to do. We are asking the function to define a variable called sum, and inside of this variable store the addition of first and second. And then another instruction for this function in line 14 is to print the results we get, to print what is going to be stored in the variable called sum. And finally, return values. We won't talk about return values now. We will just run this, and later we will talk about return values. We will talk about return values. We'll talk about return values. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump to invoke the function. So to talk about invocation. So to do that, I'll just do add nums. Then the function has already said that, okay, here it says first any, second any. It's simply telling you that you need to provide a value. You need to provide two different values because that is what the function requires. When we define the function, we actually place these parameters here so that anybody who would be using the function would provide a number here. Invoke the function. To invoke the function, you simply need to type the name of the function and then parentheses. And as you do this, you get prompted. Yes, you get prompted. You get some information about the function. This is the beauty of Visual Studio Code and other very interactive text editors. So it's going to tell you, it's going to alert you of what requirements there are for the function. It's going to show you that you need to provide a value, you need to provide data for this function. That's first. Second, so I need to provide values for this function. I know that my function is going to add two numbers together, so I need to provide numerical data. I need to provide integers or I need to provide floats for it to add. So I'll pick 14 as my first number, comma, and I'll pick 2 as my second number. So I have satisfied these two conditions. So parameters are like conditions that have to be satisfied when you use a function. So when we define the function, we said first is a condition that has to be satisfied, and second also is a condition that has to be satisfied in the sense that we have to provide data here and provide another data here. And that we have done here when we invoke the function. So here we call them parameters, but here we will call them arguments. So the parameters are the specification of the data that has to be provided, while the arguments are the data that we provide actually in the function. So I'm going to execute the script again, and then we will see what the result is. It's going to add both numbers together, and then it's going to print the value on the screen, that is 16. So we can very quickly examine the function again. The function begins, this is a user-defined function, don't forget, begins by its definition. We have to use the def keyword, and then the name of the function. If you're using more than one word, these words must not be separate. You have to link them together using underscore, or just linking the words together. Remember that the underscore, using underscore is referred to as the snake case, and then using capitalizing the beginning of the second word uh, is referred to as the camel case. So we use the snake case for naming a variable, naming a function, and then the next thing we have is parentheses, left, right, and inside of this parentheses we provide parameters. First, second, of course, the function is going to add the numbers together. So first is simply referring to the first number, and second is simply referring to the second number, which you are going to provide when you invoke or use the function. And then the last thing we have here is a colon that helps us end the function definition. And then after that, we need to decide what our function is actually going to do. We're saying the function name is add nums, meaning it's going to add numbers together. Then we actually have to do that inside. And since we have said that this function is going to require a first number and second number, so these are the numbers we're going to add. And then in line 13, we add first to second, and then we are storing the result inside a variable called sum. And then after that, in line 14, we're printing sum. I want us to pay attention to the indentation level here. The indentation level is the same for line 13 and 14. Sum and print begin at the same indentation level. This is very, very important. If you don't observe indentation levels properly, your code might not run. So this is the function we have defined, and inside of here is the code for the function, or the instruction we've given to the function. And after you have defined your function, you need to invoke or call the function. You need to use the function, and the function is going to do what you have asked it to do, as long as you provide the values that the function is going to work with. So we've specified the function is going to take a first number, and then it's also going to take a second number. The function is going to do what it wants to do with both numbers. Of course, it's going to add the numbers together. So the first value we supplied is 14, and the second value we supplied is 2. The result definitely is going to be 16. Now we can change this very quickly. 7, and then let's run the script again. We will get 21. All right. So this is basically how to define a function with parameters, and then the function is going to do something. A function that adds two numbers together. All right, let's try something out before we move on to talk about, let's see, return values. Yes, let's do something. Let's try something out. So in our function definition, we have said that we want a function to take first, second, and then what we want to do with the values that are provided there is we want to add these values together, meaning we are going to be carrying out an arithmetic process. We will be executing an arithmetic process. And that means that the values we have to provide are values that can be added. Values that can be added. Now, in Python and in programming in general, we have different data types, and some of these data types cannot work with the plus sign, which is an operator. Some of these data types cannot be added together. So the data types that can be added together generally are called integers and floats. So in Python, we have integers and we have floats, and these are the data types that can be added together. So if the intention of our function is to add numbers together, then our function is going to expect us to provide a data type that can be added together. And that's what we've done here, 14 and 7. Of course, these two are integers. We could also provide floats. For example, 7.6 is a floating point number. We could also provide floating point numbers, because floating point numbers can also be added, and then the function is going to work just fine. But again, what if we decide to provide something else that is not a number? Let's say we decide to provide a string, let's say 4. So here we're going to get to understand the important concepts of data types. Data types are different kinds of data. So as we can see now, I have provided a string here, which is different from an integer or a float. As you can see, the string is enclosed in quotes. That makes it a different data type from 14. Let's see what happens when we try to execute this code. An error message, of course. Do not let this get you confused. It says add norms 14 for line 16. So it's simply trying to tell us where the error is coming from. It says trace back most recent call last. So it's telling us to look at line 16, actually asking us to look at line 16 and 13, and then we will be able to discover what the problem is. It's also telling us that we should look at the function add norms. This is where the function is being invoked. So if we go to line 16, it's pointing us here, and it's helping us trace the problem. So it's pointing us at line 16, also pointing us at line 13. Yes, where we have the addition process taking place. The addition actually fails. So sum equals first plus second. So it's telling us that there is an error, and the kind of error we're having is type error. Python has different kinds of errors that it recognizes. The error we're experiencing right now is type error. It says unsupported operand types 4 plus int and string. Like I mentioned, we have different data types, and integers are one particular kind of data type than strings. So we cannot add integers to strings. So that's the problem we are having here. So functions specify the kind of data they are going to work with, and when we provide the wrong data, then our function will not be able to work very well. Of course, there are other ways we can work with string data, with numerical strings, and convert them and do other things to them to make sure that the arithmetic process still takes place. We won't be talking about that now, but we need to begin to understand that there are different data types, and then we can work with these different data types in different ways. Okay, return values. Return values are simply values that end a function. They end a function execution. So I could return sum. So when I return sum, I am returning the result of this addition. So return values end the execution of a function, and then they can, provide values that you can actually use. They can provide values that we can get from the functions. They can provide values that we can get from the functions. Now, this piece of code has changed significantly because, of course, it's still going to print out the sum of 14 and 8, but a significant difference is that it now has a return value. I'm going to show you what that means. I'll show you what that means. Now, what that means is I can actually store, I can actually now store the value of the sum inside of another variable. So what's happening right now is I am not going to print the result of the addition of first and second. I'm simply going to return the value. So it's going to be stored inside of the function. Once this has finished executing, the value in sum is going to be stored inside of the function. And here, that is what is going to happen. So the value stored inside of the function is now going to be stored inside of my variable called val. So I can instead print val. So this is just another way to work with functions using return values. So when I do this, all right, we still get 22. So this is what we have for functions. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at sample functions that do things that are much more significant than what we have shown you. We're going to be defining and using functions and executing functions that calculate profit with Python. We're also going to define a function that calculates perimeters, probably the perimeter of a rectangle. We're going to show you how to do this, and you can try other kinds of functions of your own that do other kinds of things. So what we've done so far is we've talked about inbuilt functions are functions that come with Python, and the examples I showed you sometimes referred to as methods, most of the times referred to as methods, but they are still functions. You don't really need to worry right now the difference between methods and functions. So inbuilt functions, user defined or customized functions. User defined or customized functions are functions that we, the users, create for ourselves or by ourselves. And you have seen an example here. Add underscore norms is a function that I have created by myself. And then some of the inbuilt functions we looked at print, ends with, capitalize, upper. And then we moved on to defining functions, the features of a function. To define a function, you need the def keyword followed by the function name, which if it contains more than one word, it needs to have these words joined together. You could use the underscore to do that, and this would be referred to as the snake case of naming variables, different from the camel case. Also, after you've named your variable, you need parentheses, and inside of this parentheses, you could put parameters there, which is not really necessary. And then you add the colon, and after the colon, you indent scope. The indentation specifies the scope of your function. The scope of the function is where your function code is going to be. So when you indent, you can now write the code for the function or the instructions that you want the function to execute. And then you could also use return values. As you saw at first in my function, I didn't have a return value. I simply printed the result of line 13. But then I chose to use a return value. All right, and I am returning sum. So that is it about functions. And this is about functions. In invoking functions, invocation of functions. To invoke a function is the same thing as to call a function or to use a function. To invoke a function, first you type the function name, and that is exactly what we have here. To invoke our underscore knobs function, we first type the function name, and then we provide a parentheses, and inside of the parentheses, because our function takes parameters, we need to provide arguments that satisfy these parameters, 14 and 8. So parentheses and arguments, and then your function is ready to go. Make sure you always save your Python file because we're going to create a small project folder that we are going to work from. This is also going to help you understand how to interact with command prompts some more, help you practice some more. So the first console Python application we'll be writing right now is an application that calculates your profit. It's going to be a very simple one. It's going to run in the console. So right here in command prompt, I'm going to create a folder for this and hit there. Maybe not necessarily. I could just go ahead to create my Python file that's going to do this. It's a very, very simple example. So I'm going to create a file called profit.py, hit enter. Okay, sorry, that's wrong. So I'm just going to do code, or let's say type, null, profit.py. All right, so now I have that profit.py file here, and then code profit.py to open the file in Visual Studio Code. It's going to be a very, very simple example of how you can create your own function that does what you want. In this case, we're going to create a function that calculates our profit. All right, so the simple thing we're going to do is no create a function def profit. Of course, we do this, and then just as we saw in the other example, we will provide parameters here so that we can supply data that profit function can work with. So to calculate profit, you need the cost price of the goods and then the selling price. So we will represent this as SP and CP. And then we do this. And then it's very simple. We create a variable called profit, or for short, we create a variable called prof. And inside of it, we're going to, use the formula for calculating profit, which is going to be selling price minus cost price. So SP minus CP. And then again, we could just print the result prof. For now, we will be using a return value right now. Of course, we could use it later. So that's all. This is the function that calculates your profit and loss. And then we need to invoke the function. So we say profit, and then we enter the values. So let's say, for example, I sold a vehicle for, let's say, 600,000. Of course, you're not allowed to use commas. I sold a vehicle for 600,000. A vehicle I bought for 200,000. Yes. So let's see. If I run the script here, it's going to be pi profit the pi. What does it return? It returns 400,000. So my profit is 400,000. So this is a simple application that helps you calculate your profit. Doesn't take so much to write. Very, very simple to write. Follow the rules. Use the def keyword, the name of your function. You provide parameters if your function will be working with parameters. Then you do the necessary things. So here we have a function that calculates profit. It's not a very difficult thing to write. The only thing right now is our application does not look interactive at all. So this is something that we can address with this function. We want it to be interactive. So one of the things we can do is we can add more arguments to the print function. The only argument the print function is taking right now is prof, which is the result of the subtraction of selling price. Sorry, cost price from selling price. So one thing we could do is we could add string value here and say profit, and then separate the first argument from the second argument using a comma to do that. So our application is going to look a little bit more interactive. I hope there's no problem here. Okay, when I run the script again now, it says profit is 400,000. But this is not interactive enough. This is not interactive enough. Now, how would the user know what to type? Sorry, how would the user be able to use this application if we already have provided the values here? So one of the things we could do is we could use another function in Python to ask the user to provide his or her own value. And that function is the input function. That's the input function. So we could say SP again equals input. We will talk about this function much later. Enter your selling price. All right. We will do the same for cost price and cost price. So this is going to change to CP. So these are the variables we're going to place here, we have to be very careful. The first requirement for the function is the selling price. So we type CP and then, sorry, SP and then CP. Okay, so this application is going to look much more interactive. It's going to require, that's what the input function is going to do. It's going to require the user to enter a selling price and then enter a cost price. So that's the essence of the input function. The input function is going to require the user to enter a value. Let's close this. Profited pi. So this time around, the application seems like it's talking to you. Enter a selling price. So I bought a fan for 65,000 naira. Sorry, I sold a fan for 65,000 naira, and this fan was bought for 45,000 naira. And then my profits, oh, there's a problem. String. Okay, good. Something has to be added very quickly. We will need to, there's what we call conversion. So I'm just going to do that very quickly, but we won't be able to discuss it so much. We will discuss this some other time. All right. So I sold the fan for 65,000 naira and I bought the fan for 45,000 naira. So my profit is going to be 20,000 naira. So much that we still need to talk about here. I have introduced the int function. I have also introduced the input function here, which help us to make the program interactive. The input function is going to allow you to enter a message that the user is going to be able to read, and this message is going to tell the user what to do. And then the user can provide data through the input function, data that is going to be collected and then used in your program. And then a new thing we've added here is integer. We had an issue with the input function. The input function returns a string, and we know that strings cannot be added. And so that we can actually do the addition, we need to convert the strings to integers. So that is why we have used the int function to do that. It says convertible to int. All right. So we can talk about different kinds of functions, inbuilt functions, and then user-defined functions, and how we can create user-defined functions starting from the def keyword, the name of the function, parentheses, and parameters, and how to interact with the parameters and do all sorts of things. So you can enhance your learning by defining your own user-defined functions. You can use parameters and then pay attention to the code you write. You can also use the examples we have given you to structure your code and create functions that can do basic things. In math, for example, you can define a function that calculates the perimeter of a rectangle. You can define a function that calculates the circumference of a circle and just do basic math and all other things. Just pay attention to how some of these functions are used here and how it works. So for example, the int function here is used to convert SP into an integer. It's also used to convert the value of CP into an integer. And why is that? It is so because right here, SP takes value from an input function. The input function returns a string. So what we have stored in SP is a string. What also we have stored in CP is a string. And that is what we pass into this function. So that's what gets here. And we know that arithmetic processes cannot be carried out on strings. As a result, we have to convert the strings to integers. So this is a function in itself. Int is a function as well, and it converts a numerical string to an integer. So these are just the basic things about this particular function called profit that we have defined. Of course, it's different from the other functions we have defined. In the other functions that we defined, we didn't use the input function to require input from the user. But in this, we have used it because we wanted to make our application a little bit interactive. We wanted the user to feel that the application was like talking to them, asking them to do things and all that. So go ahead, define your own functions and see how it works.